Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to kick off our conversation talking about Grace Boggs' early life and career. So, if you could talk about what her early life and career was like, what inspired her to begin this very long lifetime commitment to social justice movements and organizing.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'll actually start with Grace Lee Boggs' like scholarly training, right? Because I think one of the really exciting and striking things about Grace Lee Boggs is really the ways that she grounds her intellectual work in both material and political contexts. So really thinking about the kind of theoretical analysis, right, that she brought as a scholar to creating and generating a lot of theory about politics and a lot of her movement spaces, whether that's right, like rather than the kind of scholarly journal articles, she's writing things like newspapers and newsletters. So Grace Lee Boggs, she has a PhD in philosophy, right? And she got that PhD in 1940. So like thinking about the kind of historical context of that during World War II and some of the early writings, right, really shows that even as the time as she was doing her PhD, she was thinking about World War II in the context, right, of that war as an imperialist endeavor, and that she was also thinking about anti-war organizing at the time. So she gets her PhD in the 1940s. Surprise, surprise, many academic universities were not hiring Chinese women in philosophy departments. And so earlier on in her career, she moves to Chicago and was working in the philosophy library at the University of Chicago. There, right, in the University of Chicago, situated in the Hyde Park neighborhood, right, is also a historically Black neighborhood and space, right? And we can think about the kind of campus community tensions there, given the private university and the kind of landscape of a local community. But she materially, right, was living in a basement. At that time, the basement had rat infestations, which was also something that other tenants were facing. And so she became involved in tenant-based organizing, right? And already you can see those links between bringing the kind of material experience to the organizing aspect. And so then from tenant-based organizing, she also had joined the Workers' Party to start addressing some of the conditions in the South Side of Chicago that were tied, right, like to kind of historical, racial, and economic disparities. And so like she also actually has like talked about in other speeches, right, that prior to some of these organizing experiences is that she hadn't had a lot of engagement with Black communities prior to moving, and that she was bringing a lot of the kind of lens of her own experiences also as being Chinese American and those personal experiences also of oppression, to know that firsthand, right, like that people of color aren't equally treated, and that as a lens that she was bringing to the kind of cross-racial coalition and solidarity building. And so in her kind of organizing, right, that she begins to understand through both like the housing and a worker landscape, these understandings of how capitalism as a system, right, was ruining human relationships, and really beginning to see, right, like the power of when people come together to collectively organize, how they can create new things and new worlds together. Also during the time when she's organizing in Chicago, she meets CLR James, right, like who is well known as a Black radical theorist. And so she meets him in 1941 when he's giving a speech in Chicago. And so like in this like basement that she has infested with rats, they're having conversations, right, about Marx's Capital. And they start developing a pretty close working relationship, which extends for around 20 years until they split later in the 60s over differences, right, in how they're both understanding and practicing and implementing Marxism in movement spaces. But a lot of that time, right, like she's also honing the things that she's learning or has learned from her training as a philosopher to producing, right, like different movement materials with CLR James and with other folks under different pseudonyms, and really thinking about like how can we bring different political theory and philosophy to building a working class progressive movement in the US. So some of that work had included the work that she did in organizing the Third Layer School, which was a political education space for rank and file workers, Black community members, women, youth, and really thinking, right, about how do we build power by really understanding different political concepts, and how do we build at the grassroots level to think more creatively about grassroots power from the bottom up. And so it's like in these contexts, right, like from the third layer school, that she eventually meets Jimmy Boggs, who's right, her lifelong partner, but at the time, right, an auto worker and labor organizer from Detroit, and also, right, a Black radical theorist in his own, right, like in his like kind of own modality, and also has like a really rich body of work and theory. So that's like a kind of, I think, outline, right, of like where she went from kind of this alternative career that was not in academia to how she's really also bringing these kind of core tenets around study into these like early practices, right, of like tenant and worker organizing.
Thank you for such a great overview. And I'd like for us to pull apart a number of those things, because it seems almost like Grace Boggs lived multiple lives all rolled up into one.
This is like the first, like, 5-10 years. So, yeah.
How much she has engaged and what she's done. I want to go back to, you talked about her training as a philosopher and how committed she was to kind of bringing that scholarly training into this lived experience, the material and the political meeting. And her being a student, staff member at University of Chicago, and living in Hyde Park. And this is very residentially segregated community. What allowed her to make those bonds and connections from her lived experience, because there have been many other college staff and students living in those communities, not necessarily translating into, this wonderful cross-racial progressive labor movement organizing. So was that really her philosophy piece? What can we learn about what allowed her to take her lived experience and then translate that into this very long legacy of social justice organizing?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think one of the pieces that I think you're getting at is the kind of relationship building that she so clearly sets out to do, right? Like in her political work, that it is like very much grounded in place and people, right? Like, so the kind of locally inflected kind of organizing in material experiences of the people most affected in a local community, and how to both draw, right, like political theory, right, and political tactics and strategy from those spaces. And so I think when she's really thinking about the political practice of struggle, right, it's not just like her own individual identification, but really seeing the relationship between different, right, like identifications across, and to draw from community experiences of those, both what she describes as being disinherited and dispossessed by capitalism, and to do that work, right? And so while she's Chinese American, this means also doing a lot of that deep political identification with the lived experiences of Black community members in Hyde Park, given also, right, that the university itself is also highly segregated in terms of like who's actually on campus, right, like versus like who is living in the community. So I think like that particular piece, right, of her work also allows us to really think about politics, not just, right, like around like somebody's individual identity, but around this kind of collective effort towards struggle, and seeing, right, similarities, synergies across different experiences, and her ability to draw both from the personal but extend that into various political domains.
And is that was that a part of her training in philosophy, or was that just something that she brought to it? I don't often think of, if you want to be an activist, get a degree, a PhD nonetheless, in philosophy. And so I'm curious about how her philosophical training influenced her organizing, and in particular, was that just at that moment, or is that something that spans her entire career. And I know you talked a little bit about the third layer school. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that. That's actually a new I am not familiar with the history of that institution and would love to know more in the extent to which it is similar to or different from the Highlander School or other kind of social movement training grounds. So thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I really love this question about her training in philosophy because I think often, right, like people think about her as an organizer, like the kind of subject, right, of her political practice, but versus like the many manifold, both like theoretical and philosophical contributions that she makes. And I think to that question, right, like her training, this background in both philosophy and also though the study of politics and philosophy, I think is a thread that runs through her entire like her life, right, as an organizer, given that so much of the work that she does is really rooted in this basis of a kind of like rigor and discipline and asking questions and this practice of constant reflection, right? And so a lot of the ways that she's entering into movement spaces is trying to think actually about a new political philosophy of how people, right, can come together for social struggle, right? Like this kind of question she's trying to answer is like, how can mass movements create this material force for changing society? And so a lot of the kind of both like writing and movement work is helping this kind of rethinking of what it means to collectively be in the world together and develop critical methodologies, right? Like I think that's important to think about is that her movement work is also a method for answering questions about like what is our kind of political commitment, responsibility, and accountability to each other. And so I think the philosophy aspect, right, is how she's really thinking about what is like philosophy help us understand about like a kind of revolutionary public opinion that's grounded in mass struggle that materially changes the world around us. And so one of the pieces that I think really comes to the fore here, and I mentioned the third layer school, and I think, right, like the development of different schools and spaces for study, I think is a really important part of her activism. Right. And so she really sees this practice of collective study as really crucial for laying the base work, right, for building what she calls like a revolutionary cadre organization, right? That through study, we can build collective political frameworks or use study to prepare people essentially for this kind of collective struggle. So that she's really thinking about like, what does it mean to rigorously study and analyze like different dynamics of revolution, of political struggle, and through the kind of practice of study to not only kind of build theory collectively, but also have a disciplined method for political work as well, right? Like some methodology, not just for studying something, but for movement work itself. And so I think like that's a piece of it. So this happens in the third layer school, where the third layer, right, like refers to the folks who, right, this program is geared for, rank and file workers, right, like folks who often are cut out of formal political institutions, like as this kind of third layer of politics. Other spaces where she's done that, right, has been the like revolutionary study group that she had really built for kind of developing a political formation around Asian Pacific American political identity and studying different third world movements and how that might also inform and help us understand Black revolution and liberation through the 60s, 70s, at that time when that particular study group had existed. I think alongside the practice of study, I think something that she also really emphasizes in her work is this notion of criticism and self-criticism, right? And so this also ties to, I think, her deep engagement with Black radical tradition and Black radical thought. But a lot of the kind of theory that she espouses both in her intellectual and political work is this notion of what she calls dialectical humanism, right? Which sounds like a mouthful, but essentially, right, is like what she's thinking about is these very contradictory ways in which people have always struggled to create a better world for themselves, right? And in this process of struggle, it's not a linear process, but there's a lot of contradictions that begin to emerge even when we have shared vision. And so progress is not a straight line. she says, right, like, but it's like through work and through deeds, like we create new contradictions, and in that process create this kind of world building practice. And so really thinking about the contradictions that emerge in movement building has been a space that she really sits with. And she has this like really lovely quote that she describes, right, that this notion that new ideas never emerge full blown, and that like you move away from these old ways of thinking towards new ways of thinking through a continuing process of discussion, practice, and evaluation. And so this like methodologically, right, like she's creating ways for how we are practicing a mode of criticism, not only of ourselves, but the movement spaces we're part of, and always striving and endeavoring, right, for change. And so that for her is like a lifelong commitment and process. And so I think a lot of the movement work that she does has also just been a space for her to keep asking really philosophical questions, right, about people, about humanness, about society and politics. And so this kind of capacity, right, like for ongoing critique, evaluation, has been something that I think she really brings to the kind of movement building work that she does.
Yeah, what a powerful way to engage in social change and self growth as well. And to think about what am I learning? How can I apply that? What's showing up in me, and working through these complicated sets of relationships that each of us are in. And how do we kind of work through those to create more and more expanded justice in the world? And so, as someone who is a scholar of her entire body of work and her very long life of activism and engaged scholarship, could you walk us through maybe some of the contradictions in movement and self that we see her grappling with earlier in her life, and how she learns from those, and those open up new questions and new contradictions as she moves through her time?
Yeah, that's such a great question. In terms of how she's like thinking about contradictions, and often these contradictions she talks about emerge right in these kinds of creations of crises, right? And these like kind of like which and crises in these moments of like needing to move, like maybe in quicker ways than one wants to, right? Like has been like these sites in which one really has to grapple with like the contradictions that might emerge between, for example, like long-term political vision and like a shorter term material need, right? And for example, this comes to the fore often in labor organizing, right? Like there's like real material needs that people have in a moment, right? And so if you're talking about a long-term campaign, whether that's a boycott or a strike, that impacts people materially in deep ways. So I think always when she's like thinking about contradictions, it's always, I think, tied to the question of the material, which I think is really important to think about, especially the kind of both political materialist analysis that she brings. I think something else that I think is really important and sort of how she's thinking about different contradictions has also been like a kind of application of theory. So I mentioned right earlier that she did have a split with CLR James, right, at a certain point of time, and it was a split over the applications of Marxist ideology and theory, right? And for her, the importance and relevance, right, of different political theory is, does it make sense when we start using it grounded in a kind of local place-based organizing context, right? So like what is Marxism for her, like in the context, right, of organizing with auto workers in Detroit? And when it doesn't hold up, but she's like, we need to deviate like from this theory. We need to like start thinking, rethinking like that. We can't just take this in it as its whole, but really think about like, how does it actually work for us here as an organizing strategy? And I think, right, like these kinds of splits to kind of let go of different kinds of formative theories for her and try and rework them, right, into spaces that actually feel more relevant. I think it's just an example of how she notices, right, like when things are either frictious, intense, and like through that, again, practice of a kind of reflexive quality and critical, like, right, like the kind of critical reflection, like reworks both ideas and practices in a way that makes sense, again, like materially, right, like in a local space. So I think like that's something like I think that her work, both the kind of engagement with criticism and contradiction, really brings us to. And um, so yeah, I think those are some examples, right, of some of the ways that she's thinking through that.
Yeah, that's a great example. And it also highlights, again, her commitment to lived experience, right? And engaging, combining my lived experience with political philosophy and having one not be more important and subsume the other. And that tension really building out a rich and useful political theory that's not just and good theory. So you mentioned earlier her work around capitalism and capitalism's role in ruining human relationships. And I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit more and help us understand what can we learn from her understanding, her rich theoretical critique of capitalism and how it shapes our very much everyday lived experiences and social interactions.
I love this question. And I think it really ties to some of like the core roots of her political ideology and practice, right? And the kind of seeing of different material experiences as intertwined, because part of her analysis of capitalism, right, is its inseparability from racism, right? And that racism and capitalism have been core, especially to the development of US society, right? And that these two different things, racism and capitalism, or sorry, not two different things, but that racism and capitalism is intertwined, right? Systems also really find their roots, right, in the kind of dominance of Western Europe from hundreds of years ago. And so there's this kind of way that also, right, going back to her, also her roots as a philosopher, when we start thinking about different concepts, right, of political freedom, these notions of like individualism, liberalism, rationality, right, that also emerges from that same colonial and imperial history. So we can kind of see those things, right, like begin to start coming together in terms of how she's understanding racism, capitalism, imperialism. But she also then talks about like the kind of new maturation, right, or of capitalism in this, in the, at least like the moment of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s as she's thinking and writing, right? The kind of changes in capitalism since, right, like when Marx wrote Capital, that she's like, there's things actually that are different in this moment, including, right, like as capitalism has advanced, right, how she was thinking about multinational corporations, and then also specifically questions of technology and automation, right? And again, these questions of technology and automation very much tied into her experiences co-organizing with auto workers in Detroit, and the ways that automation technologies really also decimated working class communities in the Detroit area. So when she has been thinking about the kind of both, right, like understanding capitalism in relationship to technology and automation that comes at a cost, right, of people, that is really relevant because of also what automation does to political relationships for workers, right? So if you're on a factory floor and you have a different kind of proximity and relationality to the person next to you, that also changes when you introduce machines, right? Like that break work up into other component parts, right? That you don't get to see people as often, right? Like there's something that also the technology does spatially to relationships, like in that moment, right? So just wanting to flag that also as like the kind of like part of this like trajectory of like how we understand capitalism and technology. But one of the things, right, like as she's thinking about this advancement of capitalism in both like transnational ways, right, so be kind of exporting also of plants to places, is also this like um, different iteration of colonialism, right? Like by moving like factories and plants to quote unquote developing spaces. So it's like the third world spaces and revolutions that they were studying, right? Like are also now this site in which like US companies are like moving and exporting plants. All of that's coming together. So one of the things that she asks, right, and this is in this speech in 1979, reflecting on questions of leadership in the next decade moving forward, she has this question of like, why can't we reorganize our industries in a more decentralized and human scale? And how might we create new relationships between industry and agriculture, for example, so we can produce food not contaminated by capitals, sorry, so we can produce food that is not contaminated by chemicals because it's been transported thousands of miles? How do we renew relationships to and respect for nature? Why can't we reorganize housing, right? Like for the purpose of creating community and conserving energy. And so I bring up some of these quotes here because I think it's not just the ways that she's thinking about the ways that capitalism has undermined people's relationship to one another to create political solidarities, but also undermining, right, like people's relationship to their lived environment, right, and disconnecting people like from natural resources, and the extraction, right, of like resource and land and what that also does to human relationships. So I think like that's also really core and part of her analysis of, right, like the ravages of capitalism in communities, right? Like, so it's like on the kind of like, again, scale of people and place. And so this kind of notion is that like what is going on with capitalism is also, right, like destroying the kind of ways that people can relate to one another, and also, right, the kind of ease and convenience, or so-called ease and convenience, also then creates conditions where people might be able to quote unquote put off political struggle and delay those kinds of changes, which she's also like writing, right, like in very fervent ways to be like, we can't put this off any longer, right, like that this like the kind of change needs to happen now. So I think like all of those is part of that analysis. But I think one thing that's really important to root is that her engagement, right, like with criticisms of capitalism as a system, is very much tied to her commitments and co-organizing alongside for Black liberation and Black revolution, right? And especially, again, like grounding these different concepts and criticisms of capitalism in the local struggle of what was happening with workers in Detroit. So like always like resituating that, where she was like, with currently like Marx is not adequate for understanding this revolution, given that like this was a theory developed in 19th century Europe at a kind of moment in capitalism, and we again like can't just transport that theory and try to drop it in this context.
Yeah, that's so helpful, because one of the things themes we're lifting up in this particular podcast episode is Grace Boggs as one of our foremothers of intersectionality. And just in this, very brief explanation, you've introduced kind of how in her work, both theoretically and organizing, she, combines kind of the relationship between capitalism and racism and transnationalism and environmentalism. And so all of those weave together because they're all shaping our lives. And it helped me to understand more of why organizing in a specific place can actually also create repair and fight against the harms that these systems are creating. So I'd like for you to talk, one, about feminism, kind of let's throw that into this broad mix of these large systems that work together to shape people's everyday lives and separate us from ourselves as well as each other. And then to walk us through how grounding ourselves in a particular, the place where we are and in relationships with the people in those places with us can help us to resist and fight back against these large systems.
One of the ways, especially also thinking about feminist like political practice, so much of that is also rooted in relationship maintenance and building, right? Like that a lot of the work in terms of political practice, and that's grounded in feminism, and right, how feminism also engages with questions of people's like lived material experiences, is this kind of the amount of work it takes to keep relationships going. And I think that is very much tied, again, I think, to her notion, right, of like how do we not only organize within a place, but build a practice of radical commitment, right? And I think this notion of commitment is one that is really important when we think about Grace Lee Boggs, as both a political organizer, as a feminist organizer, right? That when she's thinking about feminism, and I know you brought up intersectionality earlier as like a kind of like grounding concept, but I think one of the things that she's trying to move people away from when she's starting to think about like how do we build, right, like mass movements for revolution, is like how to unlock people from these kinds of singular identities, experiences, right, but really think about how people come to and relate to one another in communities in different ways, right? And like, what does it mean? And she says this in a speech in 1999, but like that kind of work of recovering these connections and providing opportunities for people in a community to collectively participate and contribute, right? And so I think that, right, like deep seated, I think, way that she's really thinking about a commitment to relationship, I think is something, right, like when we start thinking about feminist practice, like one that we can also think about her in terms of offering us. And so this kind of importance of how we build community through a rigor practice of patience, right? And thinking about love as actually something that's hard and rigorous, right? That it's like this kind of both like deep and generous commitment to human relationships, right? Like, and to each other in community, I think is like kind of like one of these core tenets also of her practice. And so I think we can talk a little bit more about, the kind of ways that she's also thinking about these commitments to relationships in like the kind of rigored and disciplined way that she's also thinking about political theory. But I think like that, like thinking about the relationality aspect is one that I really want to highlight.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I do want us to come to, the rigor of love in this kind of interpersonal level. But before we get there, I want to back up to what you were saying in terms of recovering connections and her work to get us to have this shared understanding and a shared movement, and understanding our lives are intimately connected and our freedom and justice is intimately connected with one another, but not in a kind of universal sense where it's like, oh, just pretend you don't have these identities. Like, she starts with, there is something of value to all of us in analyzing the particularities of, your experience as an Asian American, woman or a Black woman. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us kind of what she teaches us about the value of specificity and particularity for building shared understanding and for this kind of universal commitment to each other.
I think one of the things in terms of the value of specificity and how she also practices that is that Grace Lee Boggs is well known, I think, for the kind of ways that she wants to have conversations with people, right? And I think other folks who have been in deep relationship with her in other spaces, right, like talk about this or write about this, of the kind of ways that she likes to have conversations, like wants to get to know someone, and that is part of that relationship building practice, right? But I think also, like when she's thinking about like the value of understanding specificity, it is how to always bring, right, like those particular specific qualities back towards this kind of collective development of a revolutionary cadre, right? That it's like we're not just getting to know each other for the good feelings, but like that there's a political purpose involved. And I think that piece becomes really important of how we think about her approach to the individual, right? Like that it's not a kind of replication of individualism. And so, for example, like I would say one of the things that she also talks about that also forewarns us, right? Like when we start thinking about movements today, sometimes in the kind of advent of digital activism and digital movements, is that she's also writing against like, how do we not, right, like replicate this kind of cult of personality in movement spaces, right? Like where specific individuals and leaders like seem really charismatic and that like they'll be the ones to lead us out of our oppression, right? Like her focus on like the specificities of different individuals is that like showing, right, like the relevance that each individual person, regardless, right, of like where they are in society, regardless of like whatever, has a role to play in the movement, right? Like it's not just our charismatic leaders. And so she also says, right, like that, again, like going back to her understanding of rigor and discipline, that like as individuals, right, like even as we might be called into movement in different ways and for different reasons, like she's like, we can't, right, like just go from rally to rally, meeting to meeting, right, like this kind of momentary feeling as individuals that want to be political. She's like, no, right, like this is also about like a sustained long-term development of collective struggle. I think going back to, we were talking about the study groups earlier, right? Like, and even in the creation of the Revolutionary APA study group, looking at some of the internal documents, there's such I think rigid documentation, right, of like how they're thinking about membership and who to invite. So there's like this question, right, of like individual consideration of like, so of different individuals is questions of like, what can they commit also to the movement? Like, we want you in this room, but we also need, right, a level of commitment from you. And so there's different ways that she's also thinking about how to structure individuals coming together for collective political work. And so even for these study groups, there's all of these rules, right, around like we have to start on time, right? And we're starting on time, we're meeting regularly, not canceling, because individually, right, like we're all going to begin internalizing a collective structure, and that this political work, it becomes part of our daily routines, right? And that we all have to be on time because it produces a sense of group unity because we start together. So there's like this notion, right? Like, of course, our movement spaces don't need to be so rigid, but I think what she's also, I think, really helping us think through is like, yes, like individuals matter, but that we also need like a kind of structured practice of commitment together in order to move forward politically towards, right, like mass struggle. And so a kind of way that she's also thinking about the kind of discipline of political relationality as part and very core and central to democratic practice.
Yeah, I love this political discipline and commitment. And I want to hear more about the rigor practice of patience and the rigor of love. So is that exemplified in what you just laid out for us in terms of like the values and principles behind, you know, the building of the study group, or are there other examples you could give us to help us better understand what she meant around this rigor of patience, practice of patience and love?
I think the piece that I really want to emphasize is the rigor and the practice of it. I think, right, that what she also teaches us is that these tenets of what it means to be patient and generous and to love, right, like community and people around you, is not, right, a natural, right, like given thing, right, like that we have to work towards it and practice that and incorporate that into our daily lives, right, like that the love that is tied to also like the political work that she does with and alongside community is really about like this commitment that she has for the long haul, right? Like a commitment to both the kind of political work that people are doing together and like commitment, right? Like to a political future and world. And so I think love is a word that we hear a lot, right? I think in different movement spaces and often offered, right? As like, if we have this thing, if we have love, if we have joy, it can counter, right, a lot of the kinds of like darker issues that may emerge in movements. But I think how she answers this question for us is that, right, like that as a solution, it's something we have to work towards, right? Like, so even this notion of like loving your neighbor, so and so, right? Like that takes work to get to know someone, to like move with them, to study with them, to show up like next to them again and again, and not just when it's convenient, but right as like a part of a committed practice. So I think that piece of like when you were asking, right, like it's really how she demonstrates how when we think about political work and sustaining relationships with one another, that we have to approach it um, from a way that shows a kind of dedicated practice of commitment.
Yeah, that is so helpful. And it's actually a piece of my last question, but I'm going to ask you to elaborate on it. So, this may be unfair, but I'm going to ask you to channel Grace Boggs now and speak to our young people who are organizing all around the country to defend their right to learn about, learn with, be in relationship with people who don't share their same racial identity, gender identity, sexuality, and to build this kind of shared an understanding of our lives as shared and a commitment to a collective America that is inclusive, and the tremendous battle that they're in on a daily basis in order to have this kind of education and this kind of experience. And so they don't have the privilege of sitting at the feet of Grace Boggs, but we do have you here. And so, what would you like to have Grace Boggs channel through you to them to speak personally to this specific historical moment and this opportunity and this cadre of justice workers and scholars as well? What is it that they need to hear from her to support them in the work that they're doing right now?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Grace Lee Boggs has always shown us, right, is that the path towards liberation is both continuous and also courageous, right? And more than anything, it's a process. And so, luckily, in channeling Grace Lee Boggs, I have like this helpful Rolodex of quotes that I find very useful from her to help us understand different political moments. But one of my favorites like does come from her autobiography, Living for Change, where she writes, right, there is no final struggle. So this moment that we're in, right, like it's not a final struggle, it's ongoing. And in so many, it's exhausting, right? But I think what she also offers and what she also writes is, quote, whether you win or lose, each struggle brings forth new contradictions, new and more challenging questions. And so, with that quote, right, I think it's just this provocation for us of how we imagine movement work in this moment. And also that like movement work is world building work, right? And it's a long iterative process. So, the fight for change now is not the fight for change, right? Like it's part of both a longer history of struggle and, right, like future struggles that will happen. And that change is never this like singular penultimate moment, right? Like that crystallizes and it's like we're here and we've arrived, right? But it's like this reminder that she really offers us is that we're always building towards the world we want, right? And that it's like to and maybe it's not to like be dissatisfied with the world we have, but it is, I think, what she offers, I think, to us and to different generations of activists and organizers and movement builders is that like this is ongoing. And I think that kind of push of, again, like how do we keep doing this work and find ways to sustain it, I think is something that she really offers us. And again, that reminder to engage, right? Like with the contradictions, like I do think disagreement, right? Conflict and political disagreement is part of movement work, right? And like that building consensus, coming to shared political analysis, like that's work and it doesn't happen right away. And so how do we spend, right? Like the time doing that? Because it really is often in these movement spaces also that we get to experiment and create and think about the world we want, right? Like sometimes like kind of containers of like, how do we build political consensus? How do we develop shared vision and values? Like become a way that we can workshop with people that we're in political relation with to constantly kind of engage these questions and think things through together.
Yeah, thank you. That's so helpful. And although I'd asked about it for this, our young scholars and activists, I feel very much like I needed to hear that message. and to understand it. It is humbling to recognize this is not the beginning nor the end. It takes a lot of the pressure off, but also to recognize that the work of building this consensus, the work of being in relationship, is not a it's not a problem. It's actually part of the process. It's actually integral to creating justice. And I think sometimes, you can feel like, oh my God, if they just got with it, like we could be so much further. But it is that commitment, that radical commitment to a shared vision, to us. Like we can't have a shared vision if it's mine. And so, yeah, I so appreciated you synthesizing that for me, and hopefully the other people, our audience, will benefit as much. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to lift up anything that we haven't already talked about, that you think is really important to know. And yeah, you've already shared so much with us, but I know with Grace Boggs, it goes so deep and there's so much you could possibly share. But anything that you think, we really should think about this more when we think about her contribution and her legacy.
One of the big things that she really teaches us, right, is like how to move past an individualized understanding of identity towards collective political identity. I think that does become so important, especially when we start thinking about contemporary issues and discourses such as affirmative action, right? And we've seen in many ways how affirmative action has been forced in some Asian American communities as a wedge issue, right? And when we talk about solidarity and like the work of solidarity, right, like we have seen some Asian Americans, like even from their own lived experiences, right, like feeling disenfranchised from higher education, right? But these kinds of feelings of racial discrimination, the ways that that's been weaponized, right, by other actors with interests, right, like to repeal affirmative action, right? And so I think while, right, like the repeal of affirmative action not only is anti-Black, we also have to see it as anti-Asian, right? That like how people can see those things intertwined, and that solidarity is not just for like another community, but seeing in deep ways the kind of mutual struggle. And I think that's where Grace Lee Boggs like also really leads us to, right? Like she's like as she's like coming into doing this organizing work, does have a different set, right, like of lived experiences than like the different communities that she's like building in. But right, like that, the ability to see the deep relationality towards the long political view, I think is what's really important, right? And I think a lot of the ways that her political organizing and her political theorizing also pushes us, right, like to not only think about the short term, but that there's like that solidarity is a long-term vision, and that sometimes there's like these identity-based short-term solutions that are very distracting, right, and actually um end up curtailing liberation for all, right? Like, and that these are the ways that actually different modalities of the state, different like actors, right, like with certain interests in conserving regimes of power in mind, right, like might wield these short-term solutions as a way to again detract from like the kind of longer term vision of like the world that we're collectively struggling towards. So I think the other piece I would say about solidarity that I think is very much tied to Grace Lee Boggs consideration, right, of like the rigor of relationship building is that like we can on like like de-romanticize the notion of solidarity, right, like that is also work beyond, right, like just a rallying call to maintain it, right, like takes like deep-seated efforts to get to know people, to love them, right, to like again like see shared struggles. So I think that's like really a piece of it, and like that she also like brings us, right, like that when we think about movement building and solidarity and movement spacing, that this is a rigorous practice, right, like that to be in solidarity is about rigor, it's about again like a deep commitment.